A very good Tuesday afternoon to each and every one of you. Thank you for joining us today in today's edition of our study through the Bible. We are calling this study Walking Through History, the story that God has revealed to us within His Word. We believe that it is not just a story as one might think of fictionally, but we believe this to be history, that this is history. This is His story as revealed to us, which leads us to Jesus. Thank you for joining us today. Hope that you're having a great day. And thank you for taking some time out of your day to join us for this study. With us, as always, is my good friend, Alan Seenestrang. Alan, it is good to see you today. Hope that you're enjoying God's blessings on this beautiful day.
Oh yeah, beautiful day. I love I love this time of year. Every time we get to springtime, we just enjoy being outside and before starts getting too hot. So we're excited to enjoy these next few months till we have to go back inside again come July.
That's right. Yeah, it is it's so beautiful to be able to just look out, and it gives you a type of energy that you just don't
Mhm.
have during the winter. During the winter time, you'll have to manufacture energy, really have to manufacture that juice to get you going. But springtime, it just feels like it is time for revitalization to be restored, and the energy is popping, and lots of good things around us to enjoy, and good opportunities to really get some good work done for the Lord in a variety of ways. And again, we're thankful that you're joining us today. Hope that this study will be a blessing to you. We are in 1 Samuel chapter 6 today. If you recall from our last two studies from last week, the Israelites decided as they were going to go up into battle against the Philistines that they would use the ark as a good luck charm. And they believed that so long as they had the ark, that God would be forced to be with them, because God certainly would not allow for his representation of his relationship with Israel to be defeated. He would never allow such a thing to happen in their minds. But God shows them in that text of chapter 4 that I'm not going to be manipulated. I will do as I please. You cannot force my hand, which leads to the ark actually being captured. And we see in chapter 5 that the ark of the Lord being in the hand of the Philistines wasn't good for the Philistines either. It wasn't good for Israel as they try to manipulate God. And it wasn't good here for the Philistines in chapter 5 as they tried to show their power over Israel and power over Israel's God by sticking the Ark of the Covenant within the Temple of Dagon as sort of a scalp and a memento of their victory over Israel. And yet what God shows is that even if just this piece that represents part of my power and my relationship with these people, even if it's just where it's at, I can take care of myself. God does not need men in order to fulfill his will. He will fulfill it on his own. And he did that through knocking over the statue of Dagon on a couple of occasions, and then also causing great plagues to come upon the people of the Philistines. And we're picking up here in chapter 6, where the Philistines are going to try to figure out, okay, well, what can we do to get rid of these plagues? What can we do to get this bad fortune off of our shoulders? So, Alan, if you'd like to, why don't you pick up reading for us there in chapter 6 and verse number 1, and get us going into the story today, the
All right.
continuation of the story. What are the Philistines going to do with this Ark of the Covenant, which seems to have brought them such bad luck?
Starting in verse 1, when the ark of the Lord had been in Philistine territory for 7 months, the Philistines summoned the priests and the diviners and pleaded, "What should we do with the ark of the Lord? Tell us how we can send it back to its place." They replied, "If you send the ark of Israel's God away, do not send it without an offering. Send back a guilt offering to him, and you will be healed. Then the reason his hand hasn't been removed from you will be revealed." They asked, "What guilt offering should we send back to him?" And they answered, 5 gold tumors and 5 gold mice, corresponding to the number of Philistine rulers, since there was one plague for both of you and your rulers. Make images of your tumors and of your mice that are destroying the land. Give glory to Israel's God, and perhaps he will stop oppressing you, your gods, and your land. Why harden your hearts as the Egyptians and Pharaoh hardened theirs? When he afflicted them, didn't they send Israel away, and Israel left? Now then, prepare 1 new cart and 2 milk cows that have never been yoked. Hitch the cows to the cart, but take their calves away and pin them up. Take the ark of the Lord, take the ark of the Lord, place it on the cart, and put the gold objects that you're sending him as a guilt offering in a box beside the ark. Send it off and let it go its way. Then watch. If it goes up the road to its homeland toward Beth Shemesh, it is the Lord who has made this terrible trouble for us. However, if it doesn't, we will know that it was not his hand that punished us. It was just something that happened to us by chance. The men did this. They took two milk cows, hitched them to the cart, and confined their calves in the pen. Then they put the ark of the Lord on the cart, along with the box containing the gold mice and the image of their tumors. The cows went straight up the road to Beth Shemesh. They stayed up that one highway, lowing as they went. They never strayed to the right or to the left. The Philistine rulers were walking behind them to the territory of Beth Shemesh. The people of Beth Shemesh were harvesting wheat in the valley, and when they looked up and saw the ark, they were overjoyed to see it. The cart came to the field of Joshua of Beth Shemesh and stopped there near a large rock. The people of the city chopped up the cart and offered the cows as a burnt offering to the Lord. The Levites removed the ark of the Lord, along with the box containing the gold objects, and placed them on the large rock. That day, the people of Beth Shemesh offered burnt offerings and made sacrifices to the Lord. When the 5 Philistine rulers observed this, they returned to Ekron that same day. As a guilt offering to the Lord, the Philistines had sent back one gold tumor for each city: Ashdod, Gaza, Ashkelon, Gath, and Ekron. The number of gold mice was corresponded to the number of Philistine cities of the 5 rulers, the fortified cities, and the outlying villages. The large rock on which the ark of the Lord was placed is still in the field of Joshua of Beth Shemesh today. We'll pause there just for a minute. There's kind of a little addendum at the end, but this will be a good chance to kind of wrap up this story here. Something I found interesting about this whole narrative arc is just the parallels to the children of Israel in Egypt. It mentions Egypt. Even the Philistines have heard about what happened in verse 6. It mentions
Right.
how they, why harden your hearts as the Egyptians and Pharaoh hardened theirs. Well, the ark is kind of following that same kind of journey. It's gone down to the Philistines. There was, like the Israelites went down to Egypt and were slaves, and then there were great plagues. So the rulers of the Philistines sent the Israelites away, just like Pharaoh did. But there's obviously some key differences here. There's a lot more. There's a lot more respect and fear of God shown by the Philistines here than Pharaoh ever did. They even mention, why should we harden our hearts just like Pharaoh and Egyptians hardened theirs? They were afflicted even worse. We don't want to make this even worse for us. We've seen what happens when we get this God angry. Let's give glory to God, to Israel's God, they say, and they're inquiring, how do we make amends for this? So they come up with this plan to send these 5 gold tumors and 5 gold mice that correspond with their cities, and kind of, the correspondence is with the cities, and then obviously the plagues had something to do with it, something to do with their tumors on their bodies and the mice that came and plagued them. So all of this is just to, obviously they don't know anything about what God wants or doesn't want, but they're just doing their best to send back this guilt offering, just showing that they are guilty. They acknowledge, they give glory to God, but they kind of leave themselves a little bit of an out here. You notice with this whole plan, they want to make sure that it was God and that they're not just giving up this, treasured ark and all this gold for no reason. So that's the whole point of the milk cows. Obviously milk cows are female cows, and they have their calves. So if they've just given birth, they're really attached to those 2 calves. So they would be wanting to find them and return to them. So that would show without a doubt, if those cows went the other way, away from their children, away from their calves, that would prove without a doubt that the Lord was guiding those cows. But if they returned, looking for their calves, and they just say, well, it must have been, it was just bad luck, it had nothing to do with the ark or God. We just happened to get hit with a plague for some reason. So they do this little test to make sure, and of course it turns out that it was the Lord. So he guides those milk cows back to Israelite territory, just as they thought. So the Philistine rulers, they walk away after seeing all this, and that's pretty much the end of the Philistine story for now. Like they've got rid of it. So I guess God relented from his punishment of them for the time being.
Yeah, I think you make a really great point about this having so many echoes and similarities to the Exodus story. You mentioned they mentioned the Egyptians and pharaohs here. Going back to chapter 4, they did that on the front end of this whole story whenever they're going up against the Israelites, and Israelites have the Ark of the Covenant. They say in chapter 4 in verse number 8, woe to us, who will rescue us from these magnificent gods? These are the gods that slaughtered the Egyptians with all kinds of plagues in the wilderness. And then they're having to pump themselves up to be able to go into this battle. Either we go in pumped up and give ourselves a fighting chance, or we shrink away and we lay down before them. That they say, well, we're gonna fight like men, we're gonna be strong. Now this is important to recognize, that they knew this story because that fulfills what is said back in Exodus chapter 9 and verse 16. In Exodus chapter 9 and verse 16, the Lord, as he's preparing the people, as actually he's in the midst of the plagues at this point. They've just had the sixth plague. I believe the seventh plague is about to come upon Egypt. And this is what the Lord says in verse 13 of Exodus 9:13. The Lord said to Moses, get up early in the morning and present yourself to Pharaoh. Tell him, this is what the Lord, the God of the Hebrews says, let my people go so that they may worship me, for this time I'm about to send all my plagues against you, your officials and your people. And then you will know that there is no one like me on the whole earth. For these plagues, the purpose of these plagues was for them, first of all, to show Pharaoh that I am not a God to be messed with, that you need to take me seriously, that I am the one true, all-powerful God. But then there's another layer of what these plagues were to do. Verse 15, and now I could have stretched out my hand and struck you and your people with a plague, and you had been obliterated from the earth. However, I have let you live for this purpose, to show my power and to make my name known on the whole earth, that you are acting arrogantly against my people by not letting them go. So this was not just for Pharaoh's sake, to encourage him to let the people go, but that these plagues that were coming upon Egypt, that they would live on in infamy, that they would become legendary, that they would be told throughout all the people of the earth that this people Israel, their God, just embarrassed and humiliated Egypt, this great and powerful nation, which was led by these great and powerful gods, according to the thoughts of many people, that it was the God of Israel who humiliated them and showed his true power over them. Here we are, a long time after the fact. I couldn't tell you, I mean, at least 100 years after the fact, probably, of what took place in Egypt, probably much more than that. And here we have these echoes continuing to show up again, which fulfills what the Lord said there in Exodus 9 and verse 16, that the whole earth will know. Well, that certainly includes the Philistines. Here they are knowing about what took place in Egypt. Alan, let me ask you something. As we're looking at verse 4, talk about these guilt offerings that are sent back. This actually lines up well with what we see in Deuteronomy 15, 20, or 12 through 14, that whenever you released a slave, you should send them away with gifts, which actually ends up being what, again, happened in Egypt. In Exodus 12 and verse 35, we read about the Israelites being loaded up with gold and other valuables as they're getting ready to leave Egypt. But here, those things that are valuable are the 5 gold tumors and the 5 gold mice. I'm reading back here in chapter 4 or at chapter 5, and I don't remember mice being mentioned at all. So what's for our audience that might be confused about this, and this actually shows up much more, I believe, in the Old Testament than in the New Testament. The differences between what we have with our version of the Old Testament, which is, I believe, taken from the Masoretic text, I believe is the right word for what our Old Testament is taken from, and then also the Septuagint, a different set of manuscripts. I have a number of footnotes here which speak to the differences between what we have in this text and what the Septuagint has. So if you have a little bit to speak to that, maybe you can enlighten our audience on these differences here and why it's important to recognize them and understand the value that they have for us.
You'll have to take that. I didn't really read into that too much. So,
all right. So what we have within our Old Testaments is from a specific set of manuscripts that were written in the Hebrew language. So what you have then is this set of manuscripts written in Hebrew, which is what our Old Testaments almost universally are translated from. But you also have another set of manuscripts that it's referred to as the Septuagint. Often at the bottom of your Bible, at the bottom of your text, if you have footnotes, you're going to have something that says the LXX adds this or says it this way. And that LXX is the abbreviation for the Septuagint because it was translated by about 70 scholars in the few centuries before Jesus came onto the scene. We have to remember that whenever the Israelites went into captivity, that they were scattered throughout the land, and a number of Israelites, number of Jews and Hebrews did not return to Jerusalem. They were scattered, or the land of Canaan. They were scattered within Egypt and within all the surrounding area of the world at that time. And as the generations progressed, well, they didn't speak as much Hebrew because they began to speak the language that would have been most present during that time, and that would have been Greek. So what we have happening in the few centuries before Jesus is there were these 70 scholars who took the Hebrew text and they translated it into Greek, and that became known as the Septuagint, and that was the main Bible for them, the Old Testament, the main biblical text for them that they used. And what you have is you look at these different texts, what we have in the Hebrew text and what we have in the Septuagint, the Greek text, are often differences. There's some slight differences either in language or in the retellings of stories. And while somebody might say, well, that just means the Septuagint isn't credible, we'll pump the brakes on that, because often what we find within the New Testament is Jesus and the apostles actually quote from the Septuagint on a very regular basis. In fact, they might even quote from it on a majority basis. So that shows us that the Septuagint is a legitimate text. And I do hope, and I've been told by friends who are much more in the know on manuscripts and languages and translations, that there hopes to be a full translation from the Septuagint text made available here in the next few years. And I think that's going to be a great thing to have, because it's going to give us insight into much more of the Bible story than what we might have right now. I believe it'll supplement it quite well. So what we have here specifically in this text is this mentioning of the golden mice here in chapter 6 and verse 4. Well, if you go back to, let's see here, you go back to chapter 4 and verse 6. Chapter 4 and verse 6 says that he, being God, terrified the people of Ashdod and its territory, and afflicted them with tumors. Well, in my Bible, I have a couple of notes here that says to go down to the bottom. And what I see for verse 6 is that the Septuagint adds, so the Septuagint has additional information that Alan has on the screen here, that he brought up mice against them, and they swarmed their ships, and then the mice went into the land, and there was a mortal panic in the city. Here, the CSB translators, again, using the Hebrew text, they're translating just what the Hebrew text says. And in the Hebrew text, in chapter 5 and verse 6, it mentions only the tumors. But in the Hebrew text in chapter 6 and verse number 4, it additionally adds the mice, which might confuse us until we have the text from the Septuagint, the Greek translation, which in its manuscript has in chapter 5 the tumors and the mice. So again, that's a little confusing. That's a little deep, just trying to understand and reconcile the different manuscripts that we have available to us. But that's just a little background in case you're wondering, where do these tumors and these mice come from? And that's actually going to show up again all throughout this text. Actually, I'll look at this real fast. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. There's at least 9 instances between chapters 5 and 6 where there are some manuscript differences that come into play that give us a little better insight into what is happening here. And one of those is going to be at the end that we haven't read yet, but we'll talk about that here in just a moment. But yeah, if you have any questions about that, please feel free to drop that down in the comment box, and we'll address those as best we can. I am no scholar by any means, but I know people who are a lot smarter than I am, and I've asked them a lot of questions on in this regard, and they've really been able to help shed some light on these specific issues, again, that we have mostly in the Old Testament because of the variations between the text that we have from the Hebrew manuscripts and then the Greek manuscripts of the Septuagint.
Kind of nice. I always kind of liken this to why we have 4 different gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And a lot of them, there's a lot of overlap with similar stories. Well, when you read each of those, parallel stories, there's usually a few little differences here or there, and that's, to me, that's a good thing. I mean, that shows, just like, it just shows that someone sees something a little bit differently than this person. They've got a different perspective. They add a detail. They don't put a detail in that someone else does. Like, that's not incorrect. It gives us a better version of what actually happened. So same kind of thing happening here. With the Hebrew text, was, might not have that. So we have the Septuagint to look at, two different kind of viewpoints and two different translations. And that just gives us, between the two, that gives us a much better picture of what really was originally written and what originally happened, than if we just had one single translation to go by and nothing to compare it back and forth to.
Yeah, that's right. And if my mom was a Philistine at this time, she would definitely prefer the chapter 5 version minus the mice. The mice alone would have been her undoing. One more thing, Alan, about this that we see here in this text, the correspondence between the 5 golden tumors and the 5 golden mice. People might be wondering, well, why 5? Well, it tells us that in text corresponding to the number of the Philistine rulers. And that might ring a bell in the fact that what we've seen up until this point is a pattern of the evil people surrounding Israel often being numbered in 5s. You go back to Genesis chapter 14, you have the 5 cities of the plain there, who are the antagonists in that story. You also have the 5 cities of Egypt that are mentioned specifically in Isaiah 19 and verse 18. And then here you have the 5 rulers and the 5 cities, which are mentioned in verse number 4 and also in verse number 17, Ashdod, Gaza, Ashkelon, Gath, and Ekron. All of these cities, again, show us this pattern of if you see 5 cities bundled together, that's probably a really quick sign that these are people that are against God and against his people.
At Genesis 4:1, you just said the cities of the plain. If you don't know, 2 of those cities are Sodom and Gomorrah. So
Yeah.
we know those cities a little bit better, and what happened to them. So that there's supposed to be some comparisons between them and of course Egypt as well, and their wickedness, and then the Philistines here, which makes sense. I mean, the Philistines are going to be a big chunk of narrative here, all the way through the time of David and beyond. And we've had issues with them since all the way back to Samson as well. So they're a major antagonist, on the level of the Egyptians, and then on the moral level of Sodom and Gomorrah as well, which makes it so much worse when the Israelites are worshiping the same gods and acting in the same way that the Philistines do. Oh, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. Hit my mute button. It's important to recognize that even though they are the bad guys, they clearly are. They're the ones who are against God right here. Can we recognize God's mercy and grace towards them, his love towards them, and being willing to speak to them and to teach them something in this moment? They offer God here the opportunity. I like the way Davis puts this. They offer him the opportunity to write his signature on this event through presenting to him this test of sorts, in order for them to understand what's going on with the cows. As you mentioned, the natural inclination of the mother cows in this moment would be to go back to their calves to allow them to eat. And yet they still take off and they go to the Levitical city of Beth Shemesh. And in this moment, God is speaking to them. He is giving them a revelation that, yes, I have been against you. And now that you have sent my ark back to where it ought to be, I'm going to relent. In doing that, he's given the opportunity to recognize his greatness and recognize his power, recognize that he is superior to their gods, because at the beginning of this scene, the beginning of this story of the ark being in Philistine territory, he humiliates their God. He humiliates their God in his own temple. And the question is, well, what are the Philistines going to do with this? They could, and they should, based upon this evidence, reject their God and seek to follow after the God of Israel. But unfortunately, we see that they're going to probably take Dagon to the idol doctor and get him fixed up and set him back up and continue worshiping, which is going to be the case, because we see them continuing to be a thorn in the side of God's people. But before they're even able to be a thorn in the side of God's people, we see that God's people themselves are having some issues once the ark arrives in Beth Shemesh. Verse 19 says that after all this happened, that the ark arrives back in Beth Shemesh. Again, this is a Levitical city. We read in verse 19 that God struck down the people of Beth Shemesh because they looked inside the ark of the Lord. He struck down the 70 persons, and the people mourned because the Lord struck them with a great slaughter. And the people of Beth Shemesh asked, "Who is able to stand in the presence of the Lord, this holy God? To whom should the ark go from here?" And they sent messengers to the residents of Kiriath Jearim, saying, "The Philistines have returned the ark of the Lord. Come down and get it." So verse 1 of chapter 7, again, a terrible chapter break. But nonetheless, so the people of Kiriath Jearim came for the ark of the Lord and took it to Abinadab's house on the hill. They consecrated his son Eleazar to take care of it. Alan, this section right here, beginning verse 19, going through chapter 1 of verse 7, chapter 7 of verse 1, this is another one of the places where there is some differences between manuscripts, not just the difference between the Hebrew manuscript that is used primarily for the translation of the Old Testament, but also the Septuagint, but then also just various Hebrew manuscripts themselves. For one thing, once we read in verse number 19 that he struck down 70 persons, some places add 50,000 as well. And then there's a whole thing, well, why did he do this? Well, here in the text, it says that he did so because they looked inside the ark of the Lord. But again, there are some variations there that the Septuagint adds that the sons of Jeconiah did not rejoice with the men of Beth Shemesh when they saw the ark of the Lord. So what's the deal? which one is correct? What's the best way to understand this, Alan, in this particular instance? What do you think?
For the numbers thing, it's usually pretty easy to tell if the number's wrong, because it just wouldn't make sense. I mean, 50,000 people, I mean, there's probably not 50,000 people in this entire
Right.
region. Like, this
I
is
would agree with that.
that's a huge number. So that's, that's obviously some sort of scribal error somewhere. So when you have obvious outliers like that just wouldn't even make sense at all, you can pretty easily dismiss those, even though they're written in. Ones like what their actual sin was, that's obviously a little bit more tricky to figure out. Honestly, I mean, the nice thing is usually these don't really matter either way. Looking inside the ark or not rejoicing when they did that, I mean, I'm fine with the looking or maybe even touching the ark, whatever it was. There's a lot of parallels with this journey and the journey of the ark later on when David first tries to bring it to Jerusalem. So I think
right.
that kind of, you can use that as evidence, because there's so many parallels. Well, what was some of the issues with that journey? That was when Uriah reached out and touched the ark. Well, you have the ark riding on a cart, just like here, and pulled by two cows, just like here, and just disregard for the rules for carrying and transporting the ark. And then their rule was not to touch it, or, I mean, obviously if they look inside of it, they've touched it, and they were struck down. The point here is just they were not, even though it says they were happy to see the ark, and this is actually a Levitical city that is coming to Beth Shemesh. So this is full of Levites that should have known the law a little bit better. Clearly, they've still not learned their lesson about how they should treat and respect God and the ark and what it all means. Basically, they're just, again, they think it's a token and they've lost it. Oh, well, we've got it back. Yeah, we've got good luck again. So when you treat it that way, then touching it, looking inside of it, really when it traveled around, it was typically covered, so you couldn't even see it. So it wasn't covered up, it wasn't treated with respect that they should have. So whatever the specific sin was isn't as critical as just how they treated it. And then of course, whatever they did, the Lord was displeased with that. So there was a great slaughter, 70 persons among them. And then you have this I love this little phrase here. Who is able to stand in the presence of the Lord, this holy God? To whom should the ark go from here? I mean, that's about the most wise thing you could actually say. I mean, who is able to stand? Well, the answer is
Yeah.
no one. So it's about time you figured that out. I mean, not the Philistines, even though the Philistines defeated Israel just 7 months ago with a great slaughter. So they're clearly more powerful this time. Well, they're not able to stand before him. Dagon wasn't able to stand before him. He kept falling over and, breaking. And now even though God has returned to the land of Israel and the Levites, they are not able to stand before him. And it's, obviously that's the lesson that needs to be learned here, and that
Mhm.
the people have not learned up to this point. And of course, that's a testament to their leaders, the leaders that were just killed, Hophni, Phinehas, and Eli, and then even the Levites as a whole, they have not learned this lesson yet. So they're having to do the same thing, just like the Philistines. They can't keep it because they've got a problem with people dying because of the ark, so they want to send it along too. So it again shows that the Israelites were no better than the Philistines at this point. And they're trying to hot potato it around too.
Yeah, what we have here is a sequence of gross mishandlings of God's ark, the Ark of the Covenant, this very uh, sacred object that ought to have been revered and highly respected. Go back to chapter 4, it was treated as a good luck token, and there was punishment because of that. It was stolen, and there was a great defeat. Chapter 5, it was treated as if it was weak, and if the god as if the god it represented was weak, and there was punishment because of that. Here we have the mishandling of the ark, whether it is, if we go with the Septuagint version, which would have been apathy and indifference. It was not treated as this revered object that represented, again, the power, the relationship, the law, the revelation of God. Jeconiah's people, if that's what they did, then they were struck for that. But we follow the Hebrew text here, and we recognize that it just, again, mishandled in a way that was going to bring about trouble for the people. Numbers 4 and verses 1 through 20 is what really gives us good insight into that. Specifically, verses, I believe it's verses 17 through 20, talk about what Aaron and his sons were to do in covering up the items within the ark. So here we have these people of Beth Shemesh who were just looking at things they ought not to be looking at, and not respecting the laws that have been given down concerning the ark. And I think that especially is supported by what is said here. Who was able to stand in the presence of the Lord as holy God? To whom should the ark go? Who was able to stand before the ark and do things as they ought to be done? Who can get the ark to where it needs to go in the appropriate way? So they call for the people of Kiriath Jearim, which is weird because that's a Gentile city for the most part. That's one of the Gibeonite cities from Joshua 9 and verse 17. They're going to send it away from this Levitical city to this other city, Kiriath Jearim, and it's going to remain here, and it's not going to make its way back to where it ought to be until like 2 Samuel 6, which is a long time down the road. We're going to see in our next study that 20 years it spends here in Kiriath Jearim. So it's just a cluster of mishandlings and mistakes and uh, bad decisions that are made by those who are handling the ark. And for that reason, the ark's kind of left in its own little wilderness period. It really is continuing to match what took place with the people in regards to their exodus and their wilderness wanderings. And they were in the wilderness for so long because of mistakes they made. And here we have the ark stuck in the wilderness in a sense because of the mistakes made by those who were handling it. Alan, what do you have to close us out for this study and to get us ready for chapter 7 on Saturday?
Well, following that thought, we didn't really mention it a couple chapters ago, but the first thing I would think of was, well, let's bring it back to where it was. It was at Shiloh, right? The location of the temple or the tabernacle. That's where Eli was, and that's where Samuel was, growing up and learning. But we really don't see Shiloh or the tabernacle mentioned from this point forward until David and Solomon starts working on the temple. So there's a few other verses through the prophets that kind of talk about, look what I did to Shiloh, is what they say. And so you kind of read between the lines, we can kind of assume that something happened. And I would assume when we go back to that battle at Aphek, where the Philistines defeated the Israelites and 30,000 fell, uh, the assumption is that that wasn't the only battle. The Philistines kept marching, and they really did a number on Israel, to the point where even, Shiloh might have been attacked and destroyed, and the tabernacle destroyed, or at least, something happened. Because from now on, I mean, obviously Samuel is, providing some leadership, but when he's going around and leading, he doesn't go through Shiloh anymore. So we're kind of assuming that city got destroyed, and like you mentioned, this is kind of a wilderness period for the ark, and that formal worship at the tabernacle. We just don't really see that, even though now we're going to have kings, and Saul and David. We don't have this formal worship. So and all the which makes sense, because as David kind of mentions how, the Lord's living in tents. So uh, that's why he wants to build this temple and tabernacle. I mean, that tabernacle seems to be kind of floating around a little bit right now, and it's not even, the ark's not even with the tabernacle for a long time till David brings it up. It's just in these people's houses. So this is an interesting period when you kind of read between the lines for formal worship, at the altar and at the tabernacle. We don't really see that really happening much. So, which is pretty interesting too, considering this is kind of, we're going to see start at the beginning of a rise in, God and proper Yahweh worship, led by Samuel. A little bit of a decline with Saul, but then a big rise with David and Solomon. So this is the beginning of a good period for them, but it also coincides with kind of some question marks as to the tabernacle and the ark, and the Levitical priesthood, which is going to almost get destroyed by Saul. So just kind of interesting things happening between the lines that we don't really know much about. We just kind of have to figure out from other sources.
And it's good you mentioned that this is a kind of an unsettled period of time for Israel, because that reminded me to go back to chapter 3. And we're told in that text that in those days, the word of the Lord was rare and prophetic visions were not widespread. This was time whenever because of the people's behavior, the Lord was not communicating with them in a great way. And we're introduced to Samuel we're shown here that Samuel's introduced as this next great prophet of God who would speak for the people. And yet, once we get to chapter 4 and verse 1, we read that Samuel's words came to all Israel, but then Samuel disappears from the scene. And he's not in the story in chapter 4, in chapter 5, in chapter 6, but then he shows up again in chapter 7. And we're going to see that between those two periods, things are not good. There's a lot of, as you mentioned, upheaval and an unsettled just an unsettled situation within Israel. But now God's prophet is going to come back on the scene in chapter 7, and we're going to see the blessings that come whenever God speaks to his people through his prophet. Though it is a message that's going to be difficult for them to hear and to carry out, in them doing so, there would come great blessings. Hope you'll join us for that study as we get into that text of 1 Samuel chapter 7 on Friday. We appreciate you joining us today. If you have any questions again about what we talked about, please feel free to shoot us a comment or ask a question either in the comment section or do so through the Facebook page or even on our website, Pleasant Plains Church of Christ, armorofgodonline.com, armorofgodonline.com. Thank you for joining us today. If you're looking for a group of people to worship with tomorrow night, study the Bible with, we'll be studying at 7 p.m. in person at 384 Pleasant Plains Road. But we'll also be live streaming that if you're unable to join us. Our brother Alan Brown is going to be concluding his class on the book of Ecclesiastes. He's done a great job. Really encourage you, if you haven't been able to watch or be a part of those studies, to go back. They are archived. not only on our Facebook page here, but the audio is also on our website. You can check that out as well. Again, thank you for joining us. Have a great rest of your day, and God bless you as you serve him today. Join us this upcoming Friday, 3:15, as we continue our walk through history, the story of God's history, the history of mankind as revealed to us within his word. Take care, and God bless.